Think there are continuities from Reagan to Trump, despite their vast differences.
We are just over a month away from the next US presidential election. It is the third consecutive national poll that will ask voters whether they want to select Donald Trump, a Republican candidate who has made his name from the world of celebrity, as their next president. It is not the first time that an American president has emerged from the world of show business. Ronald Reagan's success in television and Hollywood preceded his rise to becoming the 40th president of the United States, and the similarities do not end there. But how far did Ronald Reagan's presidency go in paving the way for a future President Trump? The legacy of Reagan is very much in the spotlight in a new biography by Max Boot entitled Reagan, His Life and Legend, and Max is here to discuss it with me now. Max, welcome to Times Radio. So you note in the book that you were too young to vote for Ronald Reagan, but how much of an ardent admirer you were of him and how he influenced you to join the Republican Party. What was it about his leadership that was so engaging for you?
Reagan was a very charismatic figure who really transfixed the nation and the world in the 1980s. He was, of course, the master communicator, and he had a very engaging, friendly, outgoing style, which was very appealing to a lot of people, including me. And I would say for my own personal background, he was an especially compelling figure because, I was somebody who was born in the Soviet Union, came to the U.S. as a young boy with my family. And so, like a lot of immigrants from communist countries, I tended to gravitate towards the right side of the political spectrum. And so I really thrilled to Reagan when he called out the evil empire and talked about human rights abuses or said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So, I became, a conservative and a Republican, but in a way, I would say Mr. Trump has done me a favor by pushing me to leave the Republican Party and to become an independent, because I don't think this book would have been nearly as good if I were writing it with the mindset of a committed Republican or, a Reagan loyalist. And instead, now I'm an independent. And so I think I have the objectivity and the distance from Reagan to write a truly balanced and objective account.
You write about how much of an enigma Reagan was, even to those who knew him really well. You describe him as a bit of a loner. Was he really a loner, or did he sort of pose as a loner?
No, he really was a loner. He posed as a gregarious person, and that's how he appeared to be on TV. But the people I talked to who were closest to him said that he was actually very remote, and there was kind of a coldness at his core. As Jim Baker, his White House chief of staff in his first term, said to me, you could never forget with Ronald Reagan that we were all hired hands. We weren't friends, and we could serve him loyally one day and be gone the next, and he would barely notice that we were gone. So that was a part of his personality that I traced back to his childhood in small town Illinois in the early 20th century, where he had a very difficult itinerant upbringing. His father, Jack, was this alcoholic shoe salesman who kept losing one job after another. And so Little Dutch Reagan, as he was then called, never stayed in one town long enough to really form a lot of deep friendships with other kids. And so he as a young boy, he began erecting this kind of mental fence around himself that remained intact throughout the rest of his life. And, even Nancy Reagan, the person who was closest to him, said that there were parts of him that were walled off even from her.
And as a polarizing Republican president who came from the world of celebrity, it's difficult to avoid the comparison of Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, and you don't shy away from it in this book. But they don't seem to be essentially similar people. But as a phenomenon, is it overly simplistic to look at Reagan and Reaganism as a cause of Donald Trump coming to power?
Well, I don't know about looking at Reaganism as the cause of Trump, but I think there are continuities from Reagan to Trump, despite their vast differences. And it is important to stress those vast differences. I mean, Ronald Reagan was somebody who was pro-free trade, pro-immigration, pro-alliances, pro-NATO, pro-standing up to Russia. He had a very positive, optimistic view of America and the world, very different from Trump's dour and dark vision. But as you note, they were the two presidents who were previously hosts of national TV shows before winning high office. They were both populists who often denigrated the federal government. They both played to white backlash politics. They both, often cited facts that simply were not so. I mean, Reagan never said that immigrants were eating household pets, but he certainly had a lot of faux quotes from Soviet leaders revealing their supposed designs to take over America by passing social welfare legislation. which were simply made up quotes from the John Birch Society or other extremists. So, I mean, I think you can argue that there are certain continuities from Reagan to Trump, even though I'm sure if Reagan were still alive, he would be written off by Trump Republicans as a rhino, as a Republican in name only,
Mm.
somebody who's very different from the kind of MAGA Republicans that you see in charge today.
You also point to some more sort of troubling resemblances, including Reagan's poor record on civil rights and racial justice. Was that in the Trump vein, or was that just of its time?
Well, it was both of its time and in the Trump vein. I mean, Reagan certainly never used the kind of crude rhetoric that Trump has used, but he definitely appealed to a white backlash against civil rights legislation going all the way back to his first race for political office as governor of California in 1966, where he ran against something called the Rumford Fair Housing Act, which was legislation to prohibit discrimination in the sale or rental of housing. And he opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I mean, he didn't engage in crudely racist rhetoric like George Wallace or even Donald Trump, I would say, but he certainly used kind of race-neutral coded language that white voters got when he talked about, law and order, about our streets becoming jungle paths after dark, about welfare queens, about states' rights. Those were all messages that helped to move a lot of white voters, especially white Southerners, out of the Democratic Party and to become Reagan Democrats.
You talk about the dark side of his political personality. Give us some more examples of what you mean by that. There was his handling of the AIDS pandemic on top of everything else, right?
Yeah, I think the AIDS pandemic was one of the most disgraceful episodes during his presidency, for which, ironically enough, he didn't get a lot of criticism at the time. Democrats were not really attacking him on AIDS. They were attacking him for running up high budget deficits, which in hindsight don't seem so bad or so scandalous. But what is scandalous is that, tens of thousands of Americans were dying from AIDS in the 1980s, and he never even addressed this terrible pandemic until 1987, until he was the very last years of his time in office. And he never made it a federal priority. I mean, there were people who did, including his Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, and Anthony Fauci, who was then already the director of the National Institutes of Health. But so they tried to do the best they could, but there was a complete absence of presidential leadership. And Reagan, even though I would say he was less homophobic than a lot of men of his generation, he was born in 1911, but nevertheless, he still speculated that AIDS might be God's punishment to homosexuals and that kind of thing, and really catered to the social conservative wing of the Republican Party, and as a result, just did not mobilize the federal government in a way that could have saved a lot of lives potentially.
And his populism, or to be more precise, the way he struck a pose of being like the outsider, not part of the Washington establishment, coming to that from elsewhere. Did that come out of his celebrity, his showbiz background, in the same way that it very much has done for Donald Trump?
I think so, because he didn't get his start in government. I mean, remember, he wasn't elected to any political office until 1966, when he was already 55 years old. So his outlook was formed very far from the hallways of government. And he went from being a New Deal Democrat, who was a great admirer of FDR in the 1930s. His own family, by the way, benefited from the New Deal, to becoming a very anti-government conservative Republican in the 1960s. And he maintained that posture even as he was president. So it was kind of bizarre, because he would denigrate the federal government even as he was leading it. He would, often joke that the 9 worst words in the English language are, "I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help you." And so I think he really undermined public faith in the federal government in ways that have resonated through the current day and have made possible, perhaps paved the way for Donald Trump's attacks on the quote unquote deep state.
There were big differences between their politics. I mean, aside from the sort of general sense of decorum, which is perhaps the most important one, he was an internationalist, and he particularly took a different stance from Trump on immigration, right?
Yes, he was. This is one of the paradoxes of Ronald Reagan, that he had a very poor record, as we've been discussing, on civil rights, but he was very much pro-immigration. I mean, he was, of course, the descendant of immigrants, as most Americans are. But, the irony is that, one of his slogans in 1980 was "Make America Great Again," which should be familiar. But when Ronald Reagan was talking about what made America great, it was often immigration. He was paying tribute to the immigrants who made America a great nation. And that was a core part of his belief. In 1986, even the last major immigration bill that passed Congress, he signed it in 1986, and it legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. What Trump and today's Republicans would call an amnesty bill, that was something that Reagan embraced. So I think that's one of the clearest differences between Reagan and Trump is on immigration. The other one, of course, being on his support for alliances. He loved NATO and spoke passionately about how important it was. And he also believed in standing up to Soviet aggression. So it's impossible for me to believe that Ronald Reagan would be denigrating Ukraine today or suggesting that we're wasting money on aiding Ukraine. I'm sure, like a lot of more traditional Republicans, he would be one of the foremost champions of aid to Ukraine.
What do you think he would make of Trump if he were around today? Would you think he would be a very vocal critic of Trump's?
I mean, I'm sure he would kind of shake his head in disbelief and be shocked by Trump's utterances. And remember, Trump was also very critical of Reagan in the 1980s. He took out newspaper ads saying that under Reagan the world was laughing at us and the Japanese were eating our lunch and so forth. So I don't see there's not a huge amount of overlap between Reagan and Trump, but if Reagan were alive today, I very much doubt that he would be speaking out against Trump because so few senior Republicans
Yeah.
have done that. I'm sure he would be keeping his silence like George W. Bush and others because Ronald Reagan always believed in what he called the 11th commandment, which was, thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. And of course, Trump has no problem speaking ill of fellow Republicans, but I would imagine that Reagan would put party loyalty above all, like so many others have done.
Was he an opportunist? I'm just wondering because I can well imagine like an older Ronald Reagan, maybe perhaps expressing disgust for Trump. I mean, making an exception to the you should not speak ill of fellow Republicans, maybe perhaps in the way that sort of John McCain did. But a younger Reagan, a Reagan who was younger than Trump, was he enough of a kind of an opportunist to have ridden the wave of the party in whichever direction it was going?
He was certainly an opportunist to some extent. I mean, it would be hard to be as successful as he was in politics without being an opportunist, or a kinder way of putting it is taking advantage of opportunities, right? And reading the political winds, and which is a little bit counter to his reputation as being somebody who was just this principled, dogmatic ideologue, which I don't think is really accurate because he was, he could be very ideological on the campaign trail, which helped to win a lot of votes. But then when he pivoted, he was able to pivot in office as both governor and as president to be very pragmatic and to compromise with Democrats and raise taxes as well as cutting taxes. Or as governor of California, he signed one of the most liberal abortion laws in the country. He signed one of the toughest gun control bills. We already talked about how as president, he signed a law that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. And of course, his great achievement in his second term as president was working with Mikhail Gorbachev, the world's number one communist, to peacefully end the Cold War and reduce nuclear arms, which is the last thing you would have expected from somebody like Reagan, who was such an inveterate anti-communist, had opposed détente in the 1970s. And here he was finding common ground with the ruler of the Kremlin. That's the ultimate tribute, I think, to his pragmatism. And that's something that makes him very different from Trump, because I think Trump in office was just as unhinged as Trump on the campaign trail, whereas Reagan was able to pivot to the center, moderate, and really get things done, which I think is why he's still remembered as a great president.
Speaking as somebody who's left the Republican Party, then, as you said at the start of this conversation, what should the party today learn from looking back to Reagan? What lessons should they take?
Well, I think the big lesson is what we were just discussing about the need to moderate and to cut deals to get things done. I mean, Ronald Reagan had nothing but contempt for conservatives who go over the cliff with their flags flying. That was a quote he often used. And he often said, I'd rather get 80% of what I want and come back for more tomorrow than to insist on 100% and get nothing. And unfortunately, today, compromise has become a four-letter word in the Republican Party. And the conservatives who go over the cliff with their flags flying, that's the dominant strain in the Republican Party today. And anybody who compromises is attacked as a rhino or a sellout or whatever. But that was Ronald Reagan. That was why he was successful. And I think that's a lesson that any politician of any party, but in particular today's Republicans, should learn about how you actually achieve results instead of just posturing and going down in defeat.
And look, finally, before I let you go, Ronald Reagan's humour is often remarked upon. Are there any great examples of how he used that humour to his advantage in his politics, or just indeed in his career?
Yeah, no, he was extremely quick-witted, and his humor he was one of the best joke tellers of any American president, and that was a part of his rhetorical armory that he often deployed to great effect. And I think, for example, of what happened in 1984 when in his first debate with Walter Mondale, he looks kind of old and feeble and out of it. And of course, he was 73 years old at the time, 5 years younger than Trump is today. But there was a lot of speculation at the time that Reagan was just too old to be president. And then he put those fears to rest in a second debate with Mondale when he came back with a killer quip where he said, "I will not exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience." And even Mondale had to laugh, but as he was laughing, he knew that he was losing the election right there.
Wow, and there's the famous one of after the assassination attempt, after he was shot, when he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck," which I guess shows it wasn't all scripted, right?
It was not scripted at all. And in fact, his reaction to being shot when he almost died, one of the worst episodes of his life, I think that really helped to solidify his love affair with the American public and his popular support because of how he reacted under adversity. I mean, when he was in the hospital and about to go under the knife, he was joking with the doctors saying, "I hope you're all Republicans." Or, as you just mentioned, he told Nancy Reagan, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And, that kind of good humor in the face of adversity, I think is what really made a lot of Americans fall in love with him.
Well, the book is Reagan, His Life and Legend. Max Boot, thanks very much indeed.